Egunon, lehiaketaz kanpoko sail ofizialeko filma ikusi berri dugu, Elle saga, eta orain egingo dugu prentsaurrekoa. Buenos días.
Good morning. We're going to start the press conference of the film, of the official section outside the competition. The closing film which is called Elle s'appelle Sarah, Sarah's Key. We've got Jim-Pac Bernel, we've got the actors Melusine Mayan and Dominique Frop, and the author of the book, which is Tatiana de Rosnay. They would be very glad to answer any questions. First question, please. Who wants to ask the first question?
Sin miedo.
Please don't be afraid to ask the first question. I want to congratulate you. I'm very moved by the film that you've placed on the screen in a very suitable manner. The truth from the extraordinary book of Tatiana. There are certain normal ellipses and certain cuts from the plot standpoint or storyline standpoint that are explained, but they're very well done. And they go right to the core of the plot itself or the storyline. However, there is something that I've missed in the film, the presence of the key of Sarah's key that constantly reminds her of her brother, and that injury that has never healed, or to the extent that she suicides in the novel, Tatiana justifies it with a farewell letter, which, however, can't be seen. What is not seen in the film, that ghost of her dead brother, that I thought it was extraordinary, that the presence of the boy's body in the film is quite explicit, whereas in the novel is explicit, whereas in the film is not. You don't see the body, the dead body. It's omitted, and it's sufficiently dramatic, and I think it's well shown or portrayed, but the presence of the brother which justifies Sarah's suicide is not in the film. You don't see it too well reflected, or I don't see it justified, shall we say, and the absence of that farewell letter doesn't appear. Is there any reason for this, that you've left it out? Well, is that a question or a remark? It's a question because in the novel that letter exists and the film doesn't. The question is, why isn't that letter in the film? Perhaps Tatiana would like to answer. What happens here is that there is a difference with the novel, and the fact is in the film we see it when she's a teenager and adult, whereas Tatiana in her novel, she just simply suggested, so therefore that letter did exist. But as we in the film, we see the scene where he commits suicide, she commits suicide, I think it was much better just to suggest it, because I think you understand it quite well why she commits suicide, and it's because of the enormous blame that she feels, or guilt vis-a-vis the death, she feels vis-a-vis the death of her brother. As regards to the key is seen, of course, and the scene with the father and William at the end, when she finds the key, is very important. But I wanted to be quite sincere and tell you something. It is true that now, well, quite a while now since the novel was written. Now with Tatiana, we've always said, well, we end up mixing what's in the novel, what's in the film, which stems from the novel or the film. Now what you're saying, the truth is, sincerely, I don't remember it too well, because the adaptation that we adapted the script 3 years ago. I'm not too sure whether I've answered your question, but yes, the difference is, above all, in the second half of the film, we do see Sarah as an adult, so therefore there are things that we didn't need, like, for example, that letter. I would also like to say that it is true that that letter does have a certain amount of importance in the film. In the book. That's right. But it's a letter full of emotion, and thanks to this letter, we understand the destiny or fate of Sarah. But Gilles makes Sarah relive it in the film, because we do Charlotte Poutrel, the actress, and we see her, and many of my actors thought that we lose Sarah in the book. And that letter does exist, but in the film we recover Sarah as an adolescent, as a teenager, as a young woman. We find that encounter with William's father, and then we see her death, but that is not seen in the novel.
Mais merci pour tout ce que vous avez dit à part ça. Merci beaucoup.
But thank you very much for your question and for what you said. This is a twofold question. First of all, I would like to know how the project emerges, what draws you to adapting Tatiana's novel, Do you believe that France still has to review its past as a collaborating country? And second question is, in the film you talk about, and you refer to the injuries that bring about the research of this tragedy. Do you think people come out uninjured? One leaves the film uninjured, so to speak? Okay, the reasons. First of all, I read the novel. Like many people throughout the world, the novel, The Truth, yes, really perturbed me. That it was a very beautiful, I thought it was a very beautiful story that should be on the screen. It moved me also because I lost part of my family who died in the concentration camps. This was something quite personal for me. And also, and this is a period of France's history which is not well known, and also I think that we should shed some light in that sense. And this is what Tatiana did when she wrote her novel. And also, furthermore, what I liked is that it's also part of the story. Yes, we've talked a lot about the Shoah and the Holocaust, but here we're talking about the consequences in future generations, and which draws me to answer your second question, and that is that we're trying to see how we construct our identity as men and family as a country vis-a-vis our past. The truth is, we come out without being injured when we review it. I think just like Julia's character, the truth has a price, but we have to confront that truth, otherwise we can't progress in life. And that's what the film demonstrates. It demonstrates that we have to accept the truth, digest it, and to be able to cope with it and confront it in order to progress. The novel, I didn't write this book to judge my country. I'm French. I wrote the novel in a very moved manner to transmit what I felt as a woman, mother, and human being after what took place on the 16th of July in 1942. It's not an historical novel, and I think that Gilles has understood that emotion, and Gilles has managed to retranscribe that emotion intactly through, obviously, Dominique and through Christina Scott Thomas, who plays an exact role of this journalist who's seeking the truth. But the start off from the outset wasn't the desire of writing an historical novel with any lesson or any moral lesson to learn. It was the wish to talk about those 4,000 children of the Veldiv that many people have forgotten. And I also would like to add that what I liked about the novel was the universal scope of the history. We're talking about the history of France in 1942 and of the Jewish community, but I think that we could have tell the same story which took place in Sudan or Iraq. What I liked is for Sarah to symbolize the oppressed childhood in any conflict in the world. And this is quite serious, isn't it? What surprises me is that they've not asked you, me, myself, and I, that you've not been asked about. Can you talk about the casting and how you found the young actress and the casting, which is an extraordinary cast? Well, okay, it was very difficult how we were going to find the actress, and we asked ourselves whether we were able to find someone like Melusine. Melusine, why don't you tell us how you started to work in cinema? Well, I was leaving school one day and there was a casting, an audition for a film by François Ozon, and I was chosen to act in Ricky, and there were more castings and auditions. At 7 years I was already an actor. François Ozon discovered her. And there are two elements here. First of all, if you haven't seen the film, well, if you've seen it, I'm sure you agree she's a very mature actress and an enormous maturity as well in life, because as a human being, I as a father, I said I didn't want to harm or hinder this human being at this age because she's so young. To be able to play a difficult role like she portrays in the film, I was thinking what consequences it could have in her. There's a body which is called the DAS that protects children a lot. We work always with the psychologist with you. Remember, talk to us about the psychologist.
Non, mais ça s'est bien passé.
Well, it was all really good. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to portray the role.
Yeah.
But don't contradict me, Melusine, but Melusine, she manages to differentiate cinema and reality, and she manages, despite the horrible scenes that she had to play or perform, albeit she remembered it was a film, and she even had a good time. And so all she did was to play a role, play a comedy. Now, cover your ears. Now, I believe that in the film, when she'll see it in the future, perhaps, with a different look, she might rediscover the film. And now she's also met survivors of the Holocaust. Is that right, Marlette? And it was quite moving and emotional to see this old lady, who's 80 years old, who was there in the velodrome in the Veldiv to talk to this young little girl who was going to play a role like Sarah's. It's very important. So therefore, I wanted her to be able to have true words that in the dialogues. That's to leave the history class and to find real characters, the reality, to bring about the reality of remembering. We talk about the noise, and the heat, and the smell of the velodrome. Perhaps I'm not answering your question. I hope I have answered your question of this. And the rest of the cast, and how was that auditioned for the rest of the cast? Well, we've got this main character of Melusine, and then we've also got the American journalist who's in France for the last 25 years. And we've got the fortune of having Kristen Scott Thomas, who she herself has gone through their life. She's spent the last 30 years in France. She's got an ex-husband who's French. She's got 2 French sons. And the question isn't why we chose Kristen Scott Thomas. The question is what we would have done. What if she'd have denied performing in a film? It would have been difficult. The producer of the film had already shot a film with him. We sent her the script. She liked it, and then on a special day, she was working on Broadway. It was the day of the elections when Obama won, and that's where I met her. And on that day, nobody can say no to work with you in a film. So therefore, I had that good fortune that it happened. Yes. We got the delay of the translation. The director says, Christine, you want to talk about Christine? Well, as the author, what I can say is that the day that I knew that Christine Scott Thomas was going to play Julia Ormond, I remember I was on the tube or the metro in Paris. I received an SMS by Gilles, and he simply said, KST Peroche. And I started to scream in the tube. Everyone was looking at me saying, what's the matter with this lady? But I was very happy. I was very happy due to the fact that Julia Ormond is a woman, an American woman, yes, but she knows France very well because she lives there for the last 25 or 30 years. And I thought that Kristen was exactly the same because that's what she's lived through in her own life. And when I met her, because during the shoot I was talking to her, I said that she thought that role was very close to her life. Her being English, who had married a Frenchman who has children in France, and or French children. So it coincided what I had written in the novel. So therefore I feel very, very proud that she'd accepted to participate in the project. I also should say that Kristen has an elegance and a certain natural class, which is enormous, and also she has the ability to avoid excess sentimentalism, which was very important for the film. We didn't want to fall in excess, to be excessive, for example, to the extent that the film was sufficiently difficult enough. And I believe that she contributes the necessary distance. And she says a sentence. She usually says that her character in the film has the conscience of the audience, and I agree with her on that.
Hola, buenos días.
Hi, good morning. Don't you think that the film dilutes itself, or you justify the French attitude at that period of time? Perhaps it's a mistake in my perception, but evil is reflected more or less in an abstract manner in the government, the policemen as a collective, but the individual French characters, they're all good. The married couple who adopts the grandparents who occupy the flat, and even the policeman who helps the little girls escape. But the truth is that what I'm reflecting upon is that the parents, they take over the flat without without questioning anything at all. Who was in that flat? Why could they take over and occupy that flat? What I'm saying, I'm under the feeling that it's still difficult to denunciate the attitude that was taken during this period of time by the French people or France. That's my perception. Perhaps I may be mistaken. Yes, that's your perception. If that's your perception, you're not mistaken, because that's what you feel. Also, there are other characters, like, for example, the concierge who betrays Sarah and the entire family. There are policemen who go to arrest them. There are a lot of policemen who are very harsh on them and very hard on them. But the truth is, vis-a-vis all of that, I don't want to, there are a lot of films that talk about this, where you see very bad guy and very good people. And so, therefore, what I was interested in is that grey intermediate area, that couple of farmers, played by Dominique and Neil Sagerstrup, who go and help Sarah's character. First of all, they don't want to help her, but it's as Sarah's, they end up helping us, so therefore they're not that good at the beginning. If they would have left that farm, Sarah may have died. And then it's just like the cop that helps them escape from the concentration camp, helps them, but only at a second moment. I try to differentiate between the uniform, the police, and the man within that uniform. The uniform prevents them from leaving, it traps them again, but when she calls him by name and calls him Jacques, that is the man who sees a young little girl, and it's not the same thing. And then we can also talk about the doctor who collaborates with the Germans, who tries to seek to find a young Raquel when she dies. So therefore, I understand that you may reason that way, but in France we don't perceive things that way. No, we don't perceive it that way, because France, the people see the police much more, that arrested all of those people who sent them through Trancy to go all the way to Auschwitz. And there is an approach on people who also helped, because there were a lot of Jews that were held. The French population did help a lot of Jewish people. I'm not too sure whether you add anything, Dominique, to your character. I don't know. I'm listening to what you're saying. I'm listening, as I said, to what you're saying. And when I saw the film, what surprised me to see was, without being philosophical, we received all of those ideas, all of that information, that is to say, in a place where, yes, you're right, perhaps, when you say, when we look at it with a magnifying glass in depth, the characters, we look at really nice, perhaps, characters, albeit Gilles says that the Dufour at the beginning are not that nice, and if Sarah hadn't have slept in the doghouse, perhaps she may have died, her as well as Raquel. But in turn, we do zoom into people that from the outset are not nice people, but then they tend up being people who are kind, and we're very happy that that's the case, but in a more extensive point of view, what you say, Gilles, is something that is perceived quite strongly. As I say, I said shit, you know, but I remember a film is there a film that talks about this? The issue for me is not only them being persecuted, but or the raid. I have in memory a film that shows those French policemen and how they take this to the concentration camps. No, I don't think so. I think it's a very important gesture. So therefore, I understand you completely, and the answer that Gilles has given you, it convinces me. And my look vis-a-vis the film, with a very little discourse, by the way, which means I'm going to stop in a moment, with a little amount of discourse, this gives us memories, images, that will remain with me, that will be interesting for me later on. With very few words, I think a lot is told, and I think that perhaps you realize this a bit less, but the presence of the police, the French police uniform, appear constantly in the film. This has enormous importance for the French audience. Obviously, we show a German policeman who's a nice guy, he's a bit kind, but then we see all of the police force which go and carry out the arrest of the French, the guiltiness of the Jacques family in the flat. That's very interesting. Questions aren't asked when they recover them, and they say that the apartment was empty. They say that the Tasinskis had rented it. They weren't the owners, so therefore they didn't even address the issue when they go there and take it over. So therefore we're in times of war. So therefore I got together with many people that have lived through the war. They didn't know exactly what had happened. They knew that people had been arrested, but they didn't talk about concentration camps, but work camps. So therefore the only obsession was to be able to eat, to survive. They survived in the middle of a very chaotic situation. And subsequently, because what is difficult to understand is why they stay there after what happens. And that's obviously truly difficult to understand. We were talking about this in the car yesterday, and we said that Jacques' father it was like penitence for him to stay in the apartment and to confront everything he had to confront subsequently. I'm not too sure it's clear. I hope you understand what I'm saying. I hope I'm clear. I would like to add that when I wrote the novel, I did a lot of research. I studied a lot in order to not make mistakes, to try to give just the right tone to everything that had to do with 1942. And we've talked about the concierge at the beginning of the film. She's not very kind at the beginning of the film, is she? She's the one who tells tales to the police. She says, no, they're down in the basement. No, the concierges in the 1940s didn't have a very good reputation, those concierges at all. And as regards to the apartment, the history of the apartment, or the story of the apartment, there are a lot of apartments in Paris that changed hands. These families who had been deported, put in the hands of French families who didn't even address the issue. When I've talked to people who knew, who had lived through that situation, and when I carry out the research in the testimonies that I received, Gilles is right. These were times of war, and quite often we don't realize this because we were born in the 1960s and 70s. We didn't know that, or even in the year 2000, like Melusine. But yet there was this wish and desire to survive, to find an apartment and to not ask oneself questions. Don't forget that this raid took place in the middle of the center of Paris, in one of the downtown suburbs. We're very close to the Eiffel Tower. You know where the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. So therefore there are many Parisians who saw, and they were the witnesses of this raid, and they closed their eyes. This is seen in the film and also appeared in my book. So as regards to the apartments, the same thing happened. That is to say, when there was a new tenant, the truth is they closed their eyes. And I even heard the testimony of a man who lived through the raid, but who went back after 2 weeks, like Sarah, and she found that the apartment of his parents was completely empty. They had emptied it out. It had been ransacked, and there were other people who lived there. Well, very relaxed, without even asking themselves any questions. So therefore, this was something quite frequent that took place, unfortunately, in Paris in such a stormy period.
Yo quería primero felicitaros.
Congratulate you initially for the film, because I thought it was a very moving film. And apart from this, I would like to ask you, could you explain the balancing process in between many stories? You've got not only the two times in between Kristen Thomas' character and the Jewish family characters. There are so many characters and so many stories. And then we go all the way to the farm, so to speak, and it enters into another sort of like storyline. And then she grows up, the little girl grows up, and then there's another plot that emerges. How do you manage that balance? Because that's one of the key elements of the film, because there are many films within the same film, if you catch what I'm saying. And there's another question as regards the music by Mark Richter, because I thought it was marvelous. Mark Richter, could you say something about that? I like that very much. Well, I'm going to start with Max Richter's music, and then I'm going to give the floor to Tatiana. Yes, and there's a great complexity vis-a-vis plots within and themes within the film, but that seduced me. How I manage that balance? Well, quite intuitively, but I think it's well balanced in the novel. I think it's better for Tatiana to talk about this and to talk about the genesis of all of these stories. Now, music. Max, let's talk about Max. Perhaps most of you have seen the music of Balsa de Bastian, who wrote the music of On the Nature of the Light, a film by Scorsese, which is the music when he's with his wife, imagining his wife in that scene. And Max, I thought Max had a certain amount of emotion in his music and also a certain containment, which is exactly what I wanted in the film. So therefore, I simply sent him the script. He accepted, and we've spent quite a lot of time together. He lives now in Berlin, and he's English or German. It's a bit complicated, but the case is, it turns out he lives in Berlin. It was quite moving for me because that family that was deported precisely came from Berlin, and it was the first time that I went to Berlin to record or compose the music, albeit he was a composer, but we worked together. And then we recorded it in Babelsberg, and there was a pilgrimage following the traces of my own family, which was quite moving. So therefore, thank you very much for the music. I'll tell Max, I'm sure he would be glad to hear it. I agree exactly with what you've said also. As regards to the characters in my book, we authors who write novels have a lot of imagination. I've always got a lot of different characters in all of my books, and the truth is there was quite a challenge here. There was a challenge because there were two different periods. Quite obviously, and the two main characters, Sarah and Julia, it was important that those two stories fitted together, should find themselves or should meet up at a certain point. And well, I worked as if I was already making the film in my mind. I started to imagine these characters one after another. But then for all of my, not all my films, for all my novels, the truth is, yes, I imagine them as if I was seeing them already on the screen in my mind. It is true, however, there are a lot of leaps from one to the other, but before I used to write episodes for TV in soap operas. At the end of every episode, the viewer has to end up saying, oh, what's going to happen tomorrow in tomorrow's episode? So therefore in my books, I'm very afraid that my readers get bored, and I like for there to be a certain rhythm or a certain speed or pace in my novels. And in this case I had all of these characters, and Sarah and Julia, who both seek each other in the film, and then surrounded by all of those other characters who live in their life. And then obviously the marriage crisis of Julia, I wanted to add something which is contemporary to that historical background. That's how I built things. And then we had the pregnancy with all of its symbology. Yes, of course, that's very important. The choice that she makes of not aborting and to keep the baby and to call her baby Sarah. And the character of Julia's character is a very believable character. Within the book, all of my readers thought that it was my own story, and many people said, your daughter's called Zoe. And my husband, who's here by the way, he always says, well, you're still married. And I've always got to explain, yes, of course I'm married, and I haven't gone through a divorce. I'm not Julia, if you get what I'm saying. So therefore what I managed to do was to write a character who's believable, and Gilles and Christine on the screen have also managed to represent something which is very, very believable.
Your novel and the film based on a true story, is it an authentic story? And then a question to the young lady, how old are you? And what was your most difficult part doing the film? How did you, for instance, feel when you were filming that scene where you discover your dead, the corpse of your brother in the film?
Melusine, vas-y.
Déjà, j'ai 11 ans.
I'm 11 years old. And as regards that scene, well, it was quite good. There wasn't too many difficulties at all, the truth be said. Well, yes, but tell us a bit more. Well, tell us, were you afraid before shooting the scene, or how we shot how did we rehearse? No, I wasn't afraid. I felt like really felt like doing that scene, the truth was. Everything worked quite well. I know it's difficult to believe it, but the truth is that there's no problems at all. Nothing turns out to be difficult for her. I think we were much more fearful than she was for the shooting of that scene. Well, the truth is we had rehearsed quite a lot in order for there to be a certain animal-type cry in such a powerful situation, and then the actress did everything else. She did everything else.
Fictitious, so it's not my story. However, all the parts that take place in 42, of course, I had to research them, and there was no way that I was going to take any risks with all those dates. So I spoke to people who had survived this roundup, and I went to all the places, Bonne-la-Rolande, Drancy, Pithiviers, Rueda, of course, to try and understand the atmosphere of what happened there. And however, a lot of people think that Sarah really did exist, and they're disappointed when I say that she's, sprung from my imagination. They're very disappointed. They say, no, I can't believe it. She must have existed. So I think maybe Sarah's story could have existed. The story of a little girl who tries to protect her brother. Don't forget, it's the French police who came that day to round up these people, not the Nazis. So a lot of people thought that they were going to come back. And I think that's what Sarah tried to do. She was convinced she was going to protect her brother, and she was convinced that she was going to come back, and she didn't. So that part is something that I invented, but I think it could have happened. I hope this answers your question.
Et après, j'ai envie de préciser aussi que...
Plus, I would like to say the following. She, Tatiana, had read a lot of testimonies, and I also interviewed a lot of people. So, albeit the story is a fiction story, there is a certain DNA within the story of Sarah. In the story of the survivors, and there is a certain reality in the characters, albeit it's a fiction character, which is very important for the freedom of the artist, but there is a great reality within the character. As you know, the survivors who have seen the film do feel identified with what we've done and show on the screen. Congratulations for the film, because I thought it was quite moving. I liked it very much. And I would like to ask the author, I think that this novel, when it was published for the first time, was published in English, if I'm not mistaken, because she's French, but she's also half English because her mother's English. Is that correct? And a story of this nature, a French story, why did you write it in English and not in French? And also a question to the director. The title in English is Sarah's Key, and he has changed it. I wonder, you did like Jack Goldman for like a song by Jack Goldman who talks about this, and Elle s'appelle Sarah because of the song, and in the film I don't think that information is shown in the credits. And could you say something as regards this issue? No, I didn't change the title. It was a French publisher who changed it, and he changed it for a reason which is simply that Sarah's Key in French doesn't sound too well. And that song, Comme Étoile de Femme by Jean-Jacques Goldman, which is quite well-known, it was called Sarah, she was 8 years old. That's what the song says in its lyrics. But it wasn't me, it was a publisher who decided to change the name. In order to answer you, yes, I'm perfectly bilingual because... Porque puedo cambiar...
A bit complicated for the translator, and I'm sorry about that. Donc c'est vrai que ma langue d'écriture, c'est l'anglais.
It is true that I wrote it in English. I started to write the novel in English. I started to write as a girl in English, and then I ended up publishing my first novel in French, which was called L'Appartement de Moi. And I continued to write in French as of that moment. And all of a sudden one day, well, I found Sarah and Julie came into mind, and when I started to write this novel, it came to me in English, but without me myself realizing it. It was my husband, who is always my first reader, who said, "But you're writing in English." And that's when I understood it. I understood that I had to position myself on my English side in order to be able to talk about this dark story of history of France. I don't know what a psychiatrist would say about this, but I want to take a step back vis-a-vis this difficult subject matter. On the other hand, Julia Ormond,
at all. Authentic. Donc c'est comme ça que ce livre est venu en anglais. Et d'ailleurs,
I don't know why I wrote it in English, and I continue to write in English. I've just written a book which is called Boomerang, and that's the story, and that's the reason why.
¿Más preguntas?
Further questions, please?
Bueno, entiendo.
I understand that obviously a screenplay and the adaptation of the script, you've got to add and take away things. For example, Defoe's family and the grandmother is not the one that rejects them at the beginning. There are other families that reject these young girls, and Defoe family accept them from the outset. And I understand that these things that are conventions that are quite illicit to make movies, but what's perfectly reflected is the dramatic moment that really sends a chill down your spine of how they leave the mothers, for example, when the kids. But that was done in a very masterful way. When I felt thrilled when I read the novel, and I felt it also when it was transcribed on the screen in the movie. In any case, apart from these considerations, I think that Tatiana is very harsh in the treatment of the historic reality of France, because she says in the novel that the gendarmes, the French police force, went beyond what was required, beyond the requirements of the Nazis. They went over the top the requests of the Nazis. It seemed that the Nazis only wanted to take the Jewish men. Nevertheless, they took in the kids, the children. In the novel it said there were more than 4,000 children who were the prisoners of Elle, and taken to the camps, concentration and exterminated. It seems that the Nazis didn't want the children. They didn't form part of. They were a bother. Didn't form part of the logistics. And also in the novel it talks about that there were bus drivers who took those families. There were train drivers, conductors, that is to say. They all formed part of that plot or storyline. And in the film you mentioned, there were French people who took French people, not Nazis who arrested French people. And that harshness of treating, how Tatiana treats it, I don't think it's sweetened at all in any way in the film, because the presence of the French uniforms is quite constant, but it's compressed and suggested more than explicitly. And the question is that the harshness of Tatiana is much more explicit in the film, in the book, that is to say. That's what I was saying. It's not harshness, I think it's clarity. There is expression. I didn't put any gloves. I didn't talk about it with gloves on. What I've simply tried to do is to be quite clear when I addressed it. Unfortunately, all of that took place. There were French drivers who drove the trains. It was the French police. And all of that is something that was hidden for many, many years in my country, you know. This is something that wasn't spoken, was never mentioned for many, many years, and it wasn't talked about. And so therefore, this clearness or harshness, whatever you want to call it or name it, it was something necessary for me. And that is what has allowed me to be able to give a perspective or a point of view which is very, very true as regards to what happened. I didn't want to exaggerate. I wanted to go cut to the chase. I carried out a journalist type work because I'm also a journalist. And I think that Gilles has shown it very well. And here we're entering into those subtle differences that exist. And there is a phrase which I like very much, which is a novel nourishes one's imagination. When we read a book, we have an idea in our mind of that book that we've read, but a movie shows it immediately. It shows it on the screen. It's there. Imagination doesn't really work. It's another different way of showing something or a fact. But I think Gilles has been very faithful to the novel and to answer your question specifically. Above all, we've made the film for the French audience who already knows what you're saying, so therefore we didn't have to tell them again. Perhaps there is a different appreciation abroad as regards to how it's taken in France. People like the contemporary side in France. They're very interested in the consequences to the future generations. That's how those people have lived in their families with that blame and guiltiness and with those secrets in the family, the historical facts. They know this quite better than in other countries. So therefore what we've decided to do is to not explain in detail too much what happened, things that may appear, and these will be added in the DVD. Nevertheless, it's true that abroad, and this links to what this gentleman said before, here we can have an idea, more or less, that we've flattened it out, or smoothened things out, or softened the guiltiness of the French state. But the French already know this, the French people. They knew what happened. And in more general now, the historical side wasn't the part that interested me the most. What interested me above all was the tragedy, the human tragedy that Sarah's character experiences, and how after 60 years a woman that had nothing to do with all of that wanted to re-establish and go and tell the truth. And I thought that was very passionate. I thought there was something universal. If we had entered into something too specific as regards the role of the French state, because in France, people in France, the French people know what happened, but to answer your question, the idea wasn't to soften or to smoothen out or minimalizing the role that the state played. The people in France already know this. You understand what I'm saying? Do you want to add anything, Dominique?
Suddenly, I don't know if I want to speak French or English.
I don't know whether I speak in French or in English.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. I just wanted to. I hear what Gilles told you, Mister, and I really feel in the beginning he said it's hard to approach the trueness, the truth, but when you've done it, it's good to go further away. Alors, c'est difficile d'approcher.
It's very difficult to get close to the truth, but once you get there, it allows you to go on. I think that it's very difficult to confront ghosts and the ghosts of the past, and sometimes one has to be prepared for those ghosts to devour you before you progress, and that's what the film says to me. This morning, I was talking to the distributor, Jonathan, who was in the hotel foyer, and we were laughing. We'd had drunk too much coffee, and I said, now I want to say it. And I told Jonathan, when I talk to people about this film, I say, it's the story of a journalist whose decision of writing an article opens the doors to an investigation whose need goes beyond the need of the article. I'm not sure that's clear, but what I'm saying by this is that where I didn't think it was historical, albeit Tatiana did say that she wanted to go back to the memory in order to remember the children. It's not the most important thing in the film. For me, I think the most important is the story of that journalist and the link between that time, 1942, and the story of this woman who was getting close to a truth which is going to perturb her life. She doesn't make the article creates her. And there's an important nexus or link here, and that's what I've tried to explain, that there's a link and a relationship between them. Why does that human torture start? How can a human being, despite the internal thoughts one may have as a human being, how can we, men and women, be able to establish a hierarchy that organizes this torture? How does this come to take place? It's a place when a journalist comes along, a woman, she comes along and makes the article, makes her and not her who makes the article, writes the article when it was her objective. That means that you establish a link between the adult and the child, and a link and a relationship that doesn't exist because there's no bridge between the adult and childhood. adulthood and childhood. But this journalist, thanks to her story and article, she manages to put on the scene a human being who, when he or she confronts the past, precisely through the ghosts of the past, establishes a link between the child and the adult. And for me, that's the actor. This is the journalist who turns into an actress, a human actress, who reacts, who acts, and with her feet firmly on the ground. It's a film that talks about the actor. Well, I wanted to say this, by the way. One final question, please. Hi, I would like to ask the director whether, over here, what do you think of the recent statements of the European Commissioner, and as regards the Romanian gypsies being thrown out of France? We're reminded of what happened in France in the 1940s, and whether it doesn't surprise you that the word gypsy has not emerged in this press conference after 17 questions, because it's a current affair. I don't know whether it illustrates the failure of the film or the novel, in the sense that the message, or we always think there's things that have happened in the past, albeit they're not the same, obviously. Okay, the truth is that it's a question now. We're promoting the film in France now for a month. And this is a question that when it was a current affair, a current issue, now they talk about other problems in France. They try not to talk about the problems like throwing out the Romanian gypsies. But if that question was asked quite a lot, and I think you're right, it's a good idea that you asked this question. All of us here on the panel, it surprises us how our government have created that stigma to that entire community, and albeit we shouldn't easily amalgamate things, because it isn't the same thing. I think that is quite slippery and dangerous ground. I think that the European Commissioner is right. I think that she's right in calling the French government to order. Do you agree? I would also like to add that as I travel quite a lot now with the publishing of my new book in Europe, whether this issue, well, everybody asks me in all the countries abroad, all of the people ask me, the first or the second or third question, they ask me about my president and this issue, whether Sarkozy's politics does generate a lot of debate, albeit I go there to talk about my book. Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.